On the morning of April 18th, 1906, before the sun could even break through the low fog of the bay, and before the light truly settled over the damp rooftops, the narrow house on Spofford Alley was already awake out of habit, like so many others in rented, subdivided rooms in Chinatown. But that day there was a new weight in the air, a detail that changed everything. Li Ming had left too early, taking the 2 boxes of tea and the sack of flour, and if the worst happened, he would not come back to fetch anything. In those back streets near Washington Street, almost everything depended on a man being present with documents in his pocket and the ability to answer in English when someone demanded proof. Because inspection and suspicion were not exceptions. They were routine, and one's very right to remain could be challenged by a missing paper. If Ming vanished in a shaking, Yut Lin would be left with 2 children, a baby, and papers that could turn to ash in minutes, in a city that had already treated Chinese people as suspects since the Exclusion Law of 1882 and its administrative offshoots, and that offered no patience when verification was lacking. Then the ground began to tremble as if a train were passing through the floorboards. The ginger jar fell, bowls shattered, the improvised cradle slid a few centimeters. The child woke crying, and the crying did not stop when the tremor became a roar from below, thick and unending, mixed with the crack of wood and the dull sound of masonry giving way somewhere nearby, as if the entire city were coming loose from its own joints. The Li family, a surname chosen upon arrival, recorded with uncertain spelling on a yellowed paper, as often happened in records made in haste and by ear, had little that could fall, but everything they owned was fragile. Li Ming, the provider, had left early, as he did on Wednesdays, to open the small noodle counter he kept in a rented passageway near DuPont Street, now known as Grant Avenue, but to him simply the route to work with narrow doors, coal kitchens, and rent paid and receipts kept as protection. His wife, Yut Lin, had stayed home with her younger sister, Sao Fong, with a 5-year-old boy, June, and the baby, May, who still did not walk. The shaking lasted less than a minute, but it was enough to tear the world from the place where it seemed nailed down. When the house stopped lurching, the walls kept groaning, and soon the second danger arrived, slower and harder to avoid. The smell of gas and smoke, because pipes and connections broke easily, and in San Francisco, fire often followed the leak. Shouts in English and Cantonese ran down the alleys like water, and no one needed news to understand that the city had split open. Yut Lin's hands shook as she tied the baby to her back with a cloth and pulled June by the wrist, leaving no room for hesitation. Sao Fong tried to grab the bag where they kept their papers, certificates, letters, the rent receipt, the stamped sheet that said Ming had permission to work as a cook, but the shelf had collapsed and the documents were scattered, some already stained by water from the broken jar. She stuffed what she could into her blouse, without counting, without looking, because outside, roof tiles were beginning to fall and the sound of objects crashing mixed with hurried footsteps on narrow stairways. At the corner, the sky had a strange color, as if it were neither morning nor night. A hot wind swept over the rooftops and carried ash that clung to hair and eyelashes, soot settled like fine powder on clothing and skin. On Washington Street, people ran with pillows, cages, suitcases tied with rope, bundles made from bedsheets, whatever could fit in hand and on shoulder. A man shouted for them to head toward Portsmouth Square, a known point of gathering and passage. A bell rang in the distance, and would creak as if the city were an old ship. Yut Lin tried to look toward DuPont, searching for Ming among the moving bodies, but the flow pushed everything in one direction only, away from the flames already appearing to the south, toward Market Street, where they said the fire was beginning to leap from house to house, fed by wooden buildings and by household stores of kerosene and coal. Her first impulse was to go after her husband. The second, harsher and more immediate, was to keep the children alive. The entire city seemed like a narrow door, and every choice was made under shoves. On Stockton Street, a man in uniform, no one knew whether police or soldier, ordered people to keep moving, not to stop, in a commanding tone that spread through the confusion. His English was fast and hard, and when someone answered in Chinese, he made an impatient gesture, pointing as if everyone were cattle. In Portsmouth Square, the ground was covered with people sitting on suitcases, faces turned toward the same side, where smoke formed a wall. The screams came interspersed with explosions, as if giant pots were bursting inside the streets. And there was also the heavier crash of walls and chimneys falling, followed by a brief silence before another sound, as if the city were breathing in jolts. By noon, the rumor was already moving with the force of certainty. The fire would not stop. Water had run out in many blocks. Broken pipes and failing pressure left hydrants useless and buckets insufficient. They said the army was dynamiting buildings to open fire breaks, trying to contain the advance of the flames when direct fighting became impossible. And Chinatown, even if it held in some places, was marked. For decades, the newspapers had called that part of the city a threat, filth, something foreign, and now the fire offered many a ready excuse. A man selling newspapers, his face smeared with soot, passed by shouting that the city had fallen and that the Chinese were going to be removed. Yut Lin had no way to know if it was true, but she knew enough to feel the risk. In 1882, a law had closed doors, and since then any lost paper could become deportation. The demand for proof was not abstract. It was applied at counters, in lines, in street stops, and a lack of a document could turn survivors into intruders. When afternoon came, the air grew so hot that skin burned. A group of families walked together northward, trying to reach the water, the Presidio, any open place. They crossed streets where streetcar rails appeared twisted and broken shop windows reflected flames like mirrors. Shards snapped under shoes, and each snap reminded them the ground could not be trusted. At an intersection near Broadway, a dead horse blocked part of the way, and someone covered June's eyes with a sleeve so he would not see. Baby May was heavy on Yut Lin's back, and the cloth already bore soot marks. Sao Fong carried a pot of cold rice and a bundle of clothes, and from time to time she slipped a hand into her chest to feel whether the papers were still there, as if heat could consume what was hidden as well. At night, they joined hundreds of other displaced people in an improvised camp near the Presidio, where canvas tents began to appear like mushrooms, first lined up irregularly, and then more orderly as administration tried to impose routine. The wind from the Pacific brought cold, and smoke made eyes water. There, under a starless sky, Yut Lin finally stopped searching for Ming with her eyes and began searching with her voice, asking men who passed, porters, vendors, anyone who had come from DuPont or Kearney. Some shook their heads. Others named streets that no longer existed or that were blocked by rubble and fire. One man said he had seen a noodle counter burning near Clay Street. Another said many had run toward the bay. Nothing was certain. The earthquake had broken not only houses, but the lines separating rumor from fact, and the night, with distant flares, made everything seem at once close and unreachable. On April 19th, in the gray morning light, the list began. A clerk with a clipboard wrote down names in English, trying to understand pronunciation, and many gave up on registering out of fear because registration could also mean exposure to demands and questions. Soldiers stood guard at some points, and at certain moments someone was pushed out of line for not having papers. The Lees had always lived with the awareness that the city could demand proof of existence at any time. Ming kept his certificate in an envelope and repeated that without it nobody was anybody. Now the envelope might be ash. Sao Fong opened her blouse and pulled out the crumpled papers. a rent receipt, an old letter with a Hong Kong stamp, a shopping note. The document that mattered was not there, and its absence weighed more than the absence of any object, because it was not only memory that was lost, it was defense. The following days were waiting and a controlled hunger. Communal kitchens handed out thin soup and bread in measured portions, and the line became part of the day, a discipline imposed by necessity. June, used to the smell of noodles, began to refuse the food and to ask for his father insistently, a short phrase repeated until it became noise. Yut Lin kept the boy close because there were stories of lost children and because the authorities wanted to organize people by race in separate camps with different rules and different surveillance. At the Presidio, some volunteers gave blankets. Others looked with distrust. The city, broken, showed its seams, and help came mixed with control, as if each gesture of relief were also a way to order and watch. On April 22nd, a Sunday, a messenger from Chinatown appeared in the camp, someone still moving among ruins to seek survivors and news. He carried a handwritten list of the injured taken to an improvised station at Mechanics Pavilion, near Larkin Street. Ming's name was not there, but the messenger said, in a low voice, that many men had died crushed in the DuPont area when a brick wall fell after the tremor and before the fire, in that interval when people were still trying to save goods and utensils. He also said the bodies had been taken quickly to temporary trenches or to the improvised morgue because there was no way to hold ceremonies and because heat and smoke sped decomposition. Anyone who wanted to search should go to City Hall, if City Hall was still standing, or to what remained of the Board of Health. Yut Lin listened without crying. Her face went still, as if her skin had turned to paper, and that stillness seemed a way not to come apart when everything around her had already come apart. On April 24th, she decided to go downtown. She left May with Sao Fong and took June by the hand. They walked through streets where ash reached the ankle, and each step raised dust that went into the throat. They passed what had been Market Street, now a corridor of smoking ruin, with facades open like boxes and the persistent smell of burned wood. In places, the stone was still hot, as if it held the fire inside. Men with shovels turned over debris. In front of what remained of a public building, a line formed for lost registrations and relief requests. A sign in English spoke of relief. A clerk asked names, ages, origin. Yut Lin answered in the English she had learned selling noodles. Few words, carefully chosen, because each word could become a trap. The clerk asked for her husband's document. She showed the rent receipt and the letter. He returned them with a curt gesture, saying that proved nothing, as if the previous life could be erased for lack of a specific form, as if the earthquake had authorized an administrative erasure as well. Farther on, in a fenced space, there were bodies covered with sheets. The smell was of lime and flesh. June squeezed her hand hard and began to cry before he even saw, as if the body understood before the eyes. A man said the unidentified were there. Yut Lin walked slowly, the boy behind her, and lifted a corner of cloth here and there, searching for a face she knew in detail. The small scar near the eyebrow, the thin line of the mustache, the burn mark on the right hand. Under one sheet, she found the hand with the mark, but the face was swollen and darkened. Even so, she recognized the broken thumbnail, something so small it seemed impossible to be proof, and yet it was. She did not scream. She only lowered the sheet and stood still for a few seconds, as if waiting for someone to confirm what she already knew, in a place where confirmation came in silence and in the smell of lime. The irreversibility of that moment did not come like thunder. It came like a door closing without sound. Ming would not return to the tent at the Presidio, would not return to Spofford Alley, would not return to the noodle counter. The provider, The translator, the man who spoke with landlords and guards, had become a number in a hurried register. The clerk there offered a simple paper, a death declaration without many details like so many issued under emergency conditions. Yut Lin took the paper carefully, as if it might break. It was little, but it was something that could be shown, a fragile substitute for a presence that had once opened doors and answered questions, and that now no longer existed. In May 1906, when the flames had been contained and the city began to reorganize, the refugee camps became a way of life. The tents lined up in rows. There were rules of silence at night. There was cold distribution on set days. There was also a visible effort coming from men in suits and people tied to City Hall to push Chinatown away from the center to more distant areas, as if the earthquake were an opportunity to redraw the city without that foreign piece. For Chinese families, the fear was not only hunger, but being dispersed and losing the network of help that existed in the narrow streets, in district associations, in shops that sold medicines and letter paper, and that also functioned as informal protection before a state that demanded proof and offered little. Yut Lin and Sao Fong began to frequent an improvised shed where Chinese volunteers helped fill out forms. There, at wooden tables, men with ink and stamps tried to rebuild identities. People spoke of resident certificates, of proofs required by the Chinese Exclusion Act, of how many papers had burned and how that could be used against them. Some said that with the disaster there would be tolerance. Others said the opposite. That would be the moment to expel. The authorities' English was full of terms, and any mistake could become suspicion. Yut Lin now had Ming's death paper and the chosen surname, but she did not have his certificate, nor the counter-contract, nor the account book that showed he paid taxes as he could, and the absence of those items was material, not only symbolic. It was a hole where the city could put its hand. She needed to work. Camp relief was limited and unstable, and survival demanded decisions that did not wait for morning to end. In June, with the arrival of drier days, many men were hired to remove rubble. Women, when they could, washed clothes for white families installed in provisional houses or cooked for construction crews. Yut Lin knew how to make hand-pulled noodles, knew how to make bone broth, knew how to serve quickly. But reopening a business required a license, required an address, required someone to sign in English. She no longer had the man who built those bridges, and each bridge now had to be built with paper and testimony, as if life depended on stamps. Then came informal work. In early July 1906, she began cooking on a small brazier behind a tent, selling bowls of rice porridge and stuffed buns to Chinese workers and to a few Italians and Irish who did not care about origin when hunger tightened. Sao Fong did the shopping, bargaining with vendors who brought sacks of rice from Oakland by boat, because the Bay Crossing remained a supply line while the city was still in ruins. June helped by carrying water in cans, trying to feel useful, and from time to time he stopped to watch men passing with tools, as if searching for his father in every shadow. Baby May crawled on a blanket, her hands always dirty with dust, and the dust seemed endless, as if the disaster had become a permanent layer. This survival economy had clear risks. Police made rounds, and on certain days they confiscated tents for lack of a license, as if need were an infraction. On July 16th, an officer appeared and said, in loud English, that was not permitted to sell food there. He pointed at the brazier and threatened to throw water on it. Yut Lin did not argue. She put out the fire and put away the bowls because arguing was losing time and perhaps losing more. Then, calmly, she walked to a man from the Toisin District Association who had influence and spoke better with authorities. She asked for help obtaining a temporary permit. The man listened and replied that without her husband's certificate and without proof of prior residence, City Hall might deny it. Even so, he offered a letter of recommendation from the association, with a red stamp, saying that Yut Lin was the widow of an honest worker. That stamp, in that rebuilding city, was worth almost as much as money, because it was a recognizable sign of organization and responsibility in the eyes of those who accepted only signs. In August, with stronger sun and wind bringing less smoke, some blocks of Chinatown began to be cleared. Streets like Grant Avenue and Stockton regained movement, even amid rubble. There were scaffolds, freshly cut wood, a rush to rebuild with an oriental appearance that would please tourists, an idea pushed by merchants who wanted to save businesses. But behind the planned facades was the reality that decided everything. Contracts, inspections, licenses, and the weight of a federal law that treated people as permanent suspects, demanding proof as the condition for breathing without interruption. On September 3, 1906, Yut Lin went to a temporary office set up in a structure near Van Ness Avenue, where clerks received license requests for small food businesses. She brought the association letter, Ming's death paper, a new receipt for coal purchase, and a rudimentary translation made by a volunteer. The clerk, a man with a thin mustache, looked at the papers as if searching for flaws. He asked for her husband's residence certificate. She said it burned. He asked for proof of legal entry. She did not have it. He then asked for 2 respectable witnesses who could state that she lived in San Francisco before the earthquake. Respectable, in his mouth, almost always meant white, or at least someone known to the system, someone whose signature would be accepted without argument. The barrier was not only bureaucratic, it was a way of pushing the family out of what remained to them. Without a license, any selling was vulnerable to confiscation. Without a fixed address, there was no way to rent a formal spot. And without the provider, negotiations with landlords became a trap. They demanded high deposits, promised space, and then backed away upon seeing her face and the name on the paper, as if the risk were always hers and never theirs. The moral catalyst came one late afternoon in September, when Sao Fong returned from the market with red eyes. She had seen a man she knew, a porter who used to buy noodles from Ming's counter, being taken by 2 policemen for not having a document. He shouted that the papers had burned. A policeman replied that it did not matter. The scene happened near the corner of Stockton and Sacramento, in full daylight, with people passing and pretending not to see. For Yut Lin, it drew a clear line. It was not only rebuilding a business, it was proving existence to protect the children, because the lack of paper could become the lack of ground. She decided she could not wait for the goodwill of an office. In October, she began to attend regularly a meeting room above a Chinese pharmacy on Waverly Place, where men discussed strategies to recover documents and deal with inspections. There were interpreters, people who knew which forms to fill out, and also those who spoke of risky paths, obtaining birth declarations saying children had been born in the United States, which could guarantee some kind of protection. It was talk heavy with guilt and necessity at the same time. It was not ambition, but a chance not to be torn from the place where a husband had been buried, at a moment when the city was reorganizing its maps and its exclusions. Yut Lin did not become a leader or a loud voice. She sat, listened, stored details the way one stores rice in a dry jar. She learned names of streets and departments. She learned that the Hall of Records kept copies of some documents, but that many files had burned. She learned that certain churches and missions had lists of refugees, and that those could serve as indirect proof of presence. She learned to speak calmly before men who wanted speed. And she decided to seek the 2 witnesses the clerk had demanded, because the decision was now simple and heavy. Either she produced proofs accepted by the system, or the system would produce a reason to expel them. The first was an Irish woman named Mrs. Donnelly, for whom Yut Lin had washed clothes before the earthquake. She lived near Nob Hill, in a house that had been damaged but not destroyed. On October 12th, 1906, Yut Lin walked there with June, carrying a small packet of buns as thanks, wrapped simply, because the gesture had to fit within scarcity. Mrs. Donnelly recognized her by the work, not by the name. When Yut Lin explained the need for a declaration, the woman hesitated, looking to the sides, as if afraid a neighbor might see. But then she saw June, thin, with nails dirty from old ash, and she signed a simple sentence, in large handwriting, saying that Yut Lin had worked for her since 1905 and lived in Chinatown. It was not an official document, but it was a signature in English, and that carried weight because the weight came from what the system accepted as a voice. The second witness was harder. The clerk had been clear. It needed to be someone respectable. The association man suggested an Italian merchant who bought vegetables from Chinatown. His name was Carlo Bianchi, and he kept a small grocery near North Beach. He knew Ming by sight. On October 20th, Yut Lin went to the shop with Sao Fong, carrying money saved in cloth, to pay an old debt Ming had noted in the lost account book. Carlo heard the story in silence. The city was full of people asking for things, and he too had lost goods in the fire. Still, when she placed the money on the counter and explained it was payment for an account no one else would collect, Carlo took the pen and signed. He did not do it out of heroism, but out of a simple logic of trade and small honor, the kind that survives in bad times, when credit and one's word become what remains. With the two declarations, the association letter and the death paper, Yut Lin returned to the office on November 2nd, 1906. The wind was cold, and the bay had that pewter color that announced winter. The clerk flipped through everything with less impatience than the last time. He asked questions about Ming, about the old address, about what she intended to sell. She answered in short sentences, without rushing, as someone who knows haste can look like a lie. June stood beside her, quiet, holding a worn cap someone from the camp had given him. At one point, the clerk told her to wait. She waited on a wooden bench, watching other people, many with the tired faces of those who had already lost patience, and the bench hard seemed part of the method of making the body remember it was asking. When a man returned, he brought a paper with a stamp, a provisional permit, valid for 90 days, to sell food at a specified location, subject to inspection. It was not complete victory. It was a narrow window. But it was the first time since April that something seemed to fit into a concrete place. Yet Lin did not smile. She folded the paper and put it in the inner pocket, where the fabric was thicker, as if it were an organ of the body, because paper there was physical protection. In December 1906, the family managed to rent a minimal space in a newly raised wooden building on Grant Avenue, not far from the Chinatown gate that would only be built decades later, but already on a street trying to recover its shine. The space smelled of fresh paint and sawdust. The rent was high for what it was and required advance payment, as was common when risk was placed on the tenant. Sao Fong took extra work, sewing for a workshop that produced simple clothes for laborers. June began attending an improvised school run by missionaries, where he learned words in English and also learned to lower his eyes when they spoke loudly to him. May, now nearly 2, took short steps between vegetable crates, stumbling on boards and steadying herself on whatever she found. The small business did not carry Ming's name in large letters. On the front, a painted board said "Only Noodles" in crooked English and a few characters in black. Inside, there were 2 tables and a counter. The brazier was now more stable, and the broth boiled in a large pot, with bones bought cheaply. The first customers were Chinese men who recognized the smell and needed no invitation. Then came some construction workers, drawn by the price and speed. Yut Lin worked with steady hands, pulling dough, cutting scallions, filling bowls. Her body moved as if it had always done that, but there was a constant difference. With each sale, She thought of the stamped paper and how any visit from an inspector could shut everything down because continuity depended on a document as vulnerable as a bowl. The irreversible consequence of Ming's death appeared in small scenes, repeated until they became part of daily life. When a supplier tried to charge more, because she was a woman, she had to negotiate without the shield of a male voice. When a drunken customer spoke loudly and made jokes, there was no Ming to place himself between them. When City Hall sent an inspector on January 8, 1907, a man with a clipboard and dirty boots, he asked for the owner. Yut Lin showed the provisional permit and said, in English, that the license was in her name. The inspector raised his eyebrows, as if that were abnormal, but he wrote it down and checked the cleanliness of the pots. Cao Fong held May in her arms so she would not touch the floor. June watched without blinking. The inspector left without closing the place, and the family breathed only after the door banged shut, as if the sound of wood were the end of an inspection and the beginning of another day. In February 1907, news came that the permit could be renewed, but it would require a higher fee and more documentation. The association helped again, and Carlo Bianchi confirmed in writing that they paid suppliers and caused no problems. Mrs. Donnelly, busy with her own rebuilding, did not respond immediately, but her first letter was already on file. The system worked like a gear that accepted paper as oil, and the family learned to produce paper, keep paper, protect paper from fire and water as if it were food, because the loss of a paper could mean the loss of a roof. Over time, the business became routine. It was not prosperity. It was continuity, and continuity was already a form of quiet victory. In April 1907, on the one-year anniversary of the earthquake, the city held ceremonies and speeches in places far from there, and the newspaper spoke of rebirth. On Grand Avenue, rebirth was lower and more practical. The sound of the knife on the board, the steam fogging the window, the bell on the door ringing when someone entered. Yut Lin lit a short incense stick behind the counter on a cold morning, not as spectacle, but as a private gesture. Cao Fong set a small bowl of broth beside it for a few minutes before serving the rest to customers. June, now 6, knew how to help wipe tables and knew how to count coins in English carefully. May laughed when the dough was pulled through the air like ribbon, and her laughter was a sound that had not existed in the camp. There was no return to what had existed before April 18, 1906. The house on Spofford Alley became a memory covered in ash. Ming's account book was never recovered. His certificate did not appear in any archive. His body was buried without the ceremony the family would have wanted, and the exact place of the grave was lost in the haste of a wounded city. This was not repaired. It was incorporated like a scar that does not disappear but stops bleeding, and that changes the way one touches the world. In the summer of 1907, on a clear day with wind coming off the sea, Yut Lin closed the counter early and took the children and Cao Fong to the slope of Telegraph Hill. From there, they could see the bay, the small boats, the line of Oakland in the distance, and a city that still had empty spaces where entire blocks had once been clearings of debris and Reconstruction. June held her hand without asking for anything. May, heavier now, slept in Cao Fong's arms. They stood for a while looking, without unnecessary talk, and then went back down to the street where the smell of broth was already part of the air, mixed with sawdust and the paint of new wood. What changed after that did not come as a miracle. It came as addition, as the accumulation of days in which nothing collapsed. In September 1907, a different inspector entered the shop, a younger man with his hat in his hands, and asked to see the renewed license. Yut Lin showed the thick envelope, now with 2 stamps, and he simply noted it and asked, almost as if speaking of whether the brazier was new. Sao Fong answered in simple English that it was and showed the separate bucket of water for safety. The inspector left without looking at faces as if they were a problem. That same week, Carlo Bianchi stopped by late in the afternoon with a sack of onions and 2 boxes of cheap bones, saying the shop had received too much and it was better to see it become broth than spoil. He asked no favor in return. He left it and went away with the naturalness of someone who had decided, little by little, that that door on Grant Avenue was part of the neighborhood, like any other that fed people. In October, Mrs. Donnelly appeared in person. The city had pushed people away and brought others back, and she now had new lines on her face, like someone who had spent months breathing dust. She came in slowly, sat without drawing attention, and ordered a small bowl. When June brought the food to the table with the care he had learned, she placed an extra coin on the saucer and said, in a low voice, that a neighbor needed someone to wash clothes twice a week, paid in cash, no questions. Yut Lin listened, nodded, and did not thank her excessively. She stored the information the way one stores dry coal for winter. The extra money was not only relief. It was margin not to owe any landlord before the time, in an era when debt could become eviction. At the end of November 1907, the provisional permit was replaced by a simple annual license, issued for the same address, without the repeated requirement of the 2 witnesses. The paper arrived folded, the ink still recent, and the Toys and Association man explained that some offices were tired of reopening lost cases and preferred to regularize what was already functioning, as long as the fees were paid. Yut Lin carried the document home as if carrying a full plate, and that night, after closing the door, Sao Fong sewed a new inner pocket in her coat, just for that paper. June watched the needle go in and out, and, for the first time since April of the previous year, spoke of his father without the urgency of a small child, saying only the name, as if confirming something that remained in silence. In December, the rains returned hard. The wood of the new buildings cracked with cold, and Grant Avenue gained puddles where the steam of broth mixed with the breath of passers-by. The shop, small, began to receive a kind of customer who had not entered before. Men who worked on Reconstruction scaffolds and women coming from the ferry with bags, drawn by the smell and the warm light. Some still looked cautiously at the characters on the wall, but they stayed. Yut Lin realized that when winter tightened, the entire city sought the same basic comfort, and a hot bowl reduced differences for a few minutes, the time it took to hold the ceramic and swallow without hurry. On Christmas Eve 1907, without announcement and without public ceremony, the association man brought a parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a small new wooden plaque with the characters of the Lee surname painted carefully and below, in firmer English than the old noodles, the name Lee Family Noodle Shop. It was not Ming's name, and it did not pretend to be. It was the name that kept them together. Yut Lin ran her hand over the dry paint, as if testing the texture of the future, and asked June to hold one end, while Sao Fong climbed onto a stool to fix the plaque on the inner wall behind the counter, where no inspector could object and where the family's eyes would fall every day as a reminder that what was theirs needed to be seen first by them. In January 1908, on a cold, clear morning after a night of rain, June returned from the improvised school with a crumpled paper in his pocket. It was a simple pencil drawing, a street, a door, a bowl with lines of steam, and 4 figures under a roof. The smallest had a big circle for a head and short legs, the way May still drew when she tried to draw on the floor with charcoal. June handed over the paper without saying much, and yet Lin put it in the same drawer where the coins and the license envelope are kept. The gesture did not solve the loss, but it showed that the home had reorganized itself into another shape, a shape that fit in a boy's hand and could be kept alongside money and paper as part of the same effort. By the end of that winter, South Fong stopped sewing for the workshop more hours than necessary. The shop now supported the basics, and her time began to be used there in what earned more and also in what gave presents. May, 2.5, began to speak short phrases in Cantonese and a few loose words in English, learned by hearing customers and watching June repeat lessons. On some late afternoons, when the street's flow slowed, South Fong set the girl near the counter with an empty bowl and 2 chopsticks, and May imitated the motion of eating with the seriousness of grown people, drawing discreet smiles from tired men, smiles that did not become intimacy, but became recognition of humanity. In the spring of 1908, on a Sunday with a clear sky, the family went to Portsmouth Square, not as refugees, but as residents. Children ran and fruit vendors called out, and there were still marks of the disaster in some empty spaces, but the place had returned to being a meeting point. Yut Lin brought a packet of simple buns, and June ran a little with other boys, returning with dirty knees. South Fong sat with May on her lap, and for a few minutes Yut Lin's body stopped tensing as if expecting a whistle or an order. There was no speech, no public remembrance of Ming, but there was a kind of normality that had once seemed forbidden, being there without hurry, with enough food, with a child laughing, and with the sense that the ground, even cracked, could be stepped on. The past remained the past. Ming remained dead, and that remained the stone that did not move. Even so, his consequence was not only absence. It also became the reason papers were kept. The business was defended calmly, and the children grew with the certainty that the family was not an accident tolerated, but a unit capable of remaining. The city, rebuilt in pieces, went on with its new noises, and Chinatown went on with its narrow streets and facades redesigned for outside eyes. But inside, behind a door with a bell and 2 tables, life gained a rhythm that no longer depended on waiting for a man to come around the corner, but on keeping the fire lit at the right time and the paper in the right place. At the end of 1908, when another rainy season began and the smell of wet wood again clung to clothing, the annual license hung behind the counter, protected by cheap glass, and the envelope with old letters sat in an empty tea tin, tightly closed. Yut Lin closed the door every night at the same hour, checked that the fire was out, counted coins with June, and let May fall asleep on the bench with her head against South Fong's coat. Sometimes, before putting out the lantern, she lit a short incense stick beside the inner plaque with the Li name, not to ask for anything, but to mark that the space had been won with ordinary days and difficult decisions. When the light went out and the last smell of ginger stayed caught in the cloth of sleeves, the street quieted, and inside that narrow place the family remained whole in what was possible, with steady work, with hot food, with documents kept safe, and with a small, firm peace, the kind that forms when a home fits again within its own name and goes on without needing to prove, each morning, that it has the right to exist. If you found this story meaningful, please consider liking this video. It helps these quiet, often forgotten stories reach more people. Subscribe to Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Times to stay connected to stories of everyday people who lived through moments that shaped history. Each life mattered. Each story deserves to be remembered, but we'd also love to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Our community spans across countries, generations, and experiences, all connected by a shared respect for history and the lives within it. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.